Hi everyone, today I want to talk about the Bane of the Stricken legendary gem. So this one has been introduced, I think in season 4, very long ago, to allow us, to give us kind of a little chance to kill Rift Guardians, because it had become obvious back then that Rift Guardians are essentially unkillable for almost every single build in the game once you go to a high enough tier where the Rift Guardian HP is simply so much that you are not able to finish it in time. It won't strike you as news that Greater Rifts are limited to 15 minutes, and if a Rift Guardian fight takes longer than that, then we have an issue. So this is why this gem was created. There were a lot of very cheesy strats to give builds a chance to actually kill the boss back there, including power pylons plus conduits that kind of work together and stuff like that back then. So this was changed and now we are here. But this is not enough, and over time there were a lot of builds that simply cannot kill bosses. You have insanely long boss fights on certain builds, so quite recent examples of that would be the God Demon Hunter back in season 21, for example. So back then I made a video about this where I went in a GL 150 trying to kill the boss with my God Demon Hunter with Bane of the Stricken instead of the season mechanic. And it took me, I think, something like 8 minutes or something. So there's a timer in the bottom. And if we fast forward this here, we have something like, 8.5 minutes for a single target boss, which is almost the best case scenario in that case. So obviously this is one of the more extreme examples because the season theme was insanely powerful for AoE clearing and God DH was insanely weak for single target damage, but this is not the only build in the game. Quite recently I made another video like that with the Blessed Shield Captain America build, where it's kind of the same deal. So when you have a very atrocious single target damage build like this, then you basically have no chance to kill the boss. And you see that even after like 3 minutes of stacking Stricken, I just barely got the boss down to something like 80% HP. And the only reason why I was able to actually finish the boss in time was because I had a power pylon, and that one spawned extra adds, which then improved the damage of the build to a kind of acceptable level. And in the end I was able to actually finish it. But this is again quite cheesy strats, and you can do this with other pylons, but the point remains that Bane of the Stricken is simply not enough for quite a lot of builds to actually finish the boss. I also have a bunch of more examples here where I was pushing Uliana GR 131 back in season 23, I believe. I still have that footage actually because I wanted to make some other video about this back then, but I never did. But it's still here, and we have kind of the same problem again. Uliana uses Shenlongs, and you have this exploding power mechanic where you deal more damage when there's many small enemies and they explode and kind of like chain react into each other. And then you have the boss where none of that happens and you simply deal 0 damage. So it's kind of the same thing, and you can spawn the boss here, look at that, with like almost half the timer left and still fail it. This is absolutely incredible. So I think that something really has to be done about this. Boss fights in general in Diablo 3 are typically not very exciting for most builds. Typically just stand there, stack Stricken forever, and then eventually they die. So boss fights also should be redesigned, but especially everyone has fought them like 1,000 times already. We don't need to have these 6 minute, 8 minutes, whatever boss fights on some of those builds, because everyone has seen them, and putting a bigger focus on the Rift itself when pushing is much more exciting than just punching a boss forever until it dies. So first of all, I believe that if we ever buff the player ability to kill bosses quickly through Bane of the Stricken, then we should also buff the bosses a little bit to compensate. In speed farming this usually doesn't really matter. You essentially farm at a tier where you kill a boss in like 1 to 10 seconds or so anyway, when you're doing a typical 2 minute, 3 minute speed runs. But when you push higher and higher, those boss fights become longer, and that is okay. Having kind of like a 1 minute, 2 minute, maybe 3 minute boss fight or so, I think is acceptable, but it shouldn't really be longer for that for any build in the game. And to spice up those fights, I think we could definitely give them more interesting effects. For example, there are a lot of single target bosses in the game right now, and there are some that spawn a few adds and there are some that spawn a whole like metric ton of adds. And typically for most builds in the game you are happy with a single target boss because this allows easy Stricken stacking, or you want Hamelin or Saxtus to gain a lot of extra adds. and then all the other ad bosses are usually kind of bad because they spawn rather tanky or just too few ads that steal the Bane of the Stricken stacks, and you actually deal less damage to the boss. So I believe this could be streamlined across the board to give like every single boss some ads, potentially even elites that they spawn, and that could really spice up the fights, because most of those fights are actually not really providing any interesting gameplay. Typically just stand there, nothing really going on, and yeah, you just press your buttons basically, and maybe you dodge a mechanic here and there. Some bosses are a bit more dangerous than others obviously, but it typically comes down to optimizing Stricken stacking as much as possible, and then towards the end, when the boss is almost dead and you have like 500 Stricken stacks, you can also focus a bit more on your actual DPS rotation, maybe keeping up your Endless Walk buff more, focusing more on your convention and stuff like that. So I believe that they're simply too little dynamic, and having more ads and having potentially even elite enemies spawning during the fight would be way cooler than what we have now. If the average boss fight duration goes down significantly from a rework or from a buff to the Bane of the Stricken for every build in the game, and you go down from, let's say, your typical build that kills the boss in 3 minutes down to, let's say, a 1 minute boss fight or 1.5 minutes, then having a bit more action would definitely be fine, I believe, because this is like kind of the culmination, like the final highlight of the Rift, where, you know, shit really hits the fan and you have to really focus and try to get them down, instead of this kind of being like the most boring part of the entire run most of the time. Now obviously, if there's so many ads, then we need better ways of stacking Stricken on the boss. So many builds, especially AoE builds that have no way of targeting a certain enemy, have problems stacking Bane of the Stricken on the boss, because it only gives a stack for the first enemy hit. And the first enemy hit is either kind of random, depending on which ability you're using, or you simply have no way of actually hitting the boss first when there's like 20 other targets running around. So maybe there could be kind of a mechanic where Bane of the Stricken always applies to the Rift Guardian when you hit it. So this would help out with that problem, especially in a scenario where we imagine there's ads on every single boss. So this could be some kind of like extra stack that always applies to Rift Guardians if that was part of the enemy's hit of your attack. So that could be a way to solve this, I believe, and this would allow much more freedom with what to add to boss fights in terms of other monsters. Now, second of all, we also need to work on the actual stacking mechanic itself. It is simply way too slow for some builds that have atrocious single target damage, and while those could also be singled out to improve their single target capabilities, I believe that Bane of Stricken is actually a very good target here, because this applies to basically every build at once, and then you still have some builds that have a bit longer boss fights than others, and that is kind of okay, so why not? So there are multiple ways to go about this. So for example, the second effect, this 25% increased damage to bosses and Rift Guardians, could simply be way increased to, let's say, 100% or 200% or something like that. It could also be a bit more interesting. So for example, almost every build in the game stacks a lot of area damage when pushing. So area damage is, so to say, the pushing stat for almost every build in the game. And especially those builds that do not stack area damage, with the exception of Mundunugu, Witch Doctor, I would say, are typically builds that have insanely high single target damage already. Let's say Firebirds doesn't have area damage, but has very good single target. Also the Inner Monk, for example, right now is essentially like an elite hunter that destroys bosses. So there are builds like that that do not use area damage, but theoretically you can still have a little bit from your Paragons at least, and you would gain a little bit of an effect there. But what if, for example, the Bane of the Stricken gem would transform the area damage into boss damage, so that when you stack, let's say, 150 area damage, that would apply 100% as well to bosses. The good part about this solution would actually be that it kind of solves the root of the problem, because the root of the problem is actually area damage and the fact that we can pull hundreds of enemies together to deal massive amounts of like inflated damage at the same time to many targets, while increasing our DPS to each target at the same time. So you essentially stack up faster progression on top of faster progression, and then you reach the boss and suddenly you have no area damage anymore, and the boss has even more health than other targets. So we need the Bane of Stricken to actually help us have any chance. Another suggestion that I got from a comment on YouTube on my other video was that the stacks could simply be made multiplicative. so that every single stack multiplies the damage done to the target, so it stacks up exponentially instead of linearly. So that right now, for example, you have 100 Stricken stacks, so you get 230% extra damage, and then you have 200 stacks, so it's 460% extra damage, etc, etc. So essentially what happens right now when you have very long boss fights is you stack up very high damage value, but the extra damage that you do over time becomes smaller and smaller compared to what you already have. Well, on the other hand, you would have a multiplicative scaling where basically it becomes larger and larger every single time. So that especially for builds that have trouble killing the boss and take a long time to stack up a lot of Stricken stacks, they would essentially kill the boss faster and faster and faster, way more than they do now because of this. So this would probably have to include a little nerf to the number, so this 2.3% scaling multiplicative of each other would be insanely strong, but let's say this would be like 1% or something like that, and then you could kind of like have it multiply. So if such a system would ever hit a PTR, then we could definitely test around and pinpoint a better value, but this would also be a good solution, I believe. I think another interesting way of handling this would be to increase the potency of the stacks depending on the target's HP. So what I mean is that when the target has 100% HP, just when the boss spawns, each stack that you apply gives a higher amount than what it does when the target is almost dead, so that you stack up your damage very quickly early in the fight. So in the first like 10% of the Rift Guardian's like life loss, so to say, you get the most stacks, and then you also deal damage faster and faster to the boss. This would be another way of allowing builds that have atrocious single target damage to just stack up the damage a bit faster and then slowly melt away the boss afterwards. I think what would also be an amazing change for Bane of the Stricken to make it more interesting and to help solve another issue, which is the so-called elites issue, as I call it, which is essentially you start a Greater Rift push and you go through your floor 1 and you stack up a bunch of elites and you clear the entire floor, kiting those elites around, and then 5 minutes later you hit the entrance to floor 2 and you have killed none of those elites because, well, there's not enough trash to actually proc air damage for you anymore, and all those elites left at 10% or 20% HP have to be left behind and forgotten, unless you get a colony right around the corner. So this is another very typical scenario while pushing, and it kind of creates this problem of colony or bust. And I believe that Bane of the Stricken could also be made to kind of work in those scenarios where maybe it applies to the first 3 or the first 5 enemies hit instead of just the first enemy, so that you can kind of stack up Bane of the Stricken on elites as well as you fight them over minutes and minutes, and here and there, you know, you hit the right target, those elites inside the pool with Bane of the Stricken stack, and you slowly improve the damage. And then as the density thins out and there's only, let's say, 10 targets left, like 2 or 3 yellow packs or some blue packs or something like that, you slowly stack up more and more damage on them to actually give you a chance to finish them in a timely manner. So I didn't spend a lot of time looking for the perfect example of this now, but here's just to give you an illustration of what's happening. So I went through this entire Festing Woods, and now we found a yellow here towards the end of the floor, like from the pylon, and yeah, it's like 80%, so it's quite high. I didn't really fight this for like 5 minutes, just for like 1 minute. But if you had like another elite from like earlier in the floor and you kind of kite it with you, then you hit the floor exit here, and even if elites are left at like 10% HP, almost always the right play is to leave them behind and forget about them, unless you have a colony somewhere here. So for example, if we go to floor 2 and I spawn a colony right here, then I would go back and finish it, but this is literally the only scenario where that would happen. And this is essentially the same for almost every single build. So giving Bane of the Stricken a bit of like AoE capability and elite killing capability would definitely be a really great solution to alleviate this problem and make pushing a bit more interesting and a bit less dependent on really just the top map types, the top monster types, so that you actually have a chance to finish elites. And again, in the scenario where potentially we buff Rift Guardians to have a lot of extra adds, this would also help to actually gain an extra stack on the boss instead of on some random ad that will die a few seconds later and the stack is lost forever. So to conclude this, I believe that the core problem of Rift Guardians having way too much health on the higher tiers is not gonna go away no matter what, unless we get an expansion where this problem could be solved with, you know, some tweaks to builds in general and to Rift Guardians in general, but I don't see that happening. So Bane of the Stricken is the solution that we have, and it's already used by almost every single build in the game anyway. So I believe we could just double down on that, but bring it up to a modern level that is suitable for 2022 and onwards, and maybe have some adjustments to how the gem works so that the game becomes more fun, and Rift Guardians at the same time could also be buffed to actually be more interesting to fight. So those are my 2 cents on the topic. Let me know what you think. Maybe you have some other cool ideas of what to do with Bane of the Stricken, what to do with Rift Guardians in general. Maybe you're totally content fighting Raziel for 8 minutes, who knows? But in my opinion, stuff could definitely be spiced up a bit to make the game more interesting, especially the solo pushing. So let me know what you think. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.